I do know having a world market is good for all of us. It's good for every consumer. It's good for every producer to be much more like an oil market that is able to distribute out natural gas around the world. The LNG really boom and the ability to trade that worldwide is, in my opinion, a game changer and it makes it to where companies can depend on long-term futures of natural gas.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome to the future of energy on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Tom Ward, CEO of Mach Natural Resources. We'll be discussing his work at Chesapeake in pioneering the U.S. shale boom and oil and gas renaissance, and how it laid the foundations for the future of energy. Hello, Tom. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Well, Dave, thank you for having me on.
I'm really thrilled to have you join us today to kick off our new series, The Future of Energy. The future of energy begins in a present in which the United States is the world's top oil and gas producer and a leading exporter of LNG, and Chesapeake Energy, which you founded with Aubrey McClendon when you were only 29 years old, was the shale gas drilling pioneer that helped transform the United States into the energy powerhouse that it is today. And I imagine the effects of this shale production boom you pioneered at Chesapeake were far more profound and wide-ranging than you could have imagined when you were starting off. You know, from the U.S. LNG helping Europe avoid the worst of its energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to natural gas displacing the use of coal in U.S. power generation, and being critical to making the renewable solar and wind power generation needed for the energy transition to a lower carbon energy system reliable. So I'm curious, if we turn back the clock, what led you to start Chesapeake, and what were you looking to achieve at the time?
I'm 64 now, so getting older, and have lived a long life through energy. But whenever I started out, I was just looking for a job. So I met Aubrey McClendon in 1982. And one of the main events of 1982 was there was a small bank in Oklahoma City called Penn Square Bank that had a failure in July of 1982. And really through the spring of 1982 into the summer of 1982, the energy business was in kind of a free fall down. The longer story to why, how I got to Chesapeake was that I grew up in a very small area. I didn't have really any plans to do anything other than just stay there for the rest of my life, maybe work at a plant or a natural gas plant that was outside of town, or if that would be a very fortunate outcome, or it would be a pumper of oil wells, or just to work labor in the oil fields. But I was fortunate to, in my senior year of college, to determine to go to college, and then my girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, we married whenever I was 19. She was 18, so after my freshman year of college. And I spent the next 3 years through 1981 going to the University of Oklahoma, and we both worked our way through school. I didn't have any debt. I didn't even know really what debt was in those times. And my father had passed away when I was 16, so I was on my own basically. And I've always felt comfortable at working, and I knew that I could provide for a family. Maybe not in the ways that I can today, but always thought that there was clearly some way that I would put food on the table. So the long winding story is I did graduate from the University of Oklahoma in 1981. I started in the energy business, and by the spring of 1982, I was looking for a job and I had one child that was just over a year old. and was in need of some employment. So I actually worked during the summer of 1982 cutting wheat in western Oklahoma in the small town that we lived in, and met some local farmers, worked for some that I had previously given money to through energy companies. I was a lease broker and distributed out cash during the boom days of 1980, 81, and 82. And I became friends. We lived in their small community. They ended up being my investors. So I had a very small investment group that would take participations in wells, and this was post Penn Square, so there wasn't any capital around. And Aubrey, at the same time, had a group of investors from Florida, basically the same size that I was, and we ended up competing with each other on the same type of projects, trying to find very small working interest in wells that were being drilled in and around Oklahoma. I had access to a lot of maps of counties of Oklahoma, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so I colored formations by production, and I got to learn basically all of the different plays that were going on vertically in Oklahoma in the late 70s, early 80s, and spent that time, came to good use because I could still remember those plays as they were being developed and helped us to work on different projects in later years. But to answer your question, is Aubrey and I met because we were two guys competing with each other. We were 3 days apart in age. We both had basically the same amount of income, which was not very much. And we needed each other to go forward and start working different projects. I was 29 whenever Chesapeake was formed, but from 23 through 29, we worked together on a handshake basis, sharing all of our expenses. And during that time, we participated in 600 wells together, as he was Chesapeake Investments and I was TLW Investments. And that's where Chesapeake came from, was his idea of a name which was much better than my initials. So that was the founding of Chesapeake, was really based upon growing during a time that others didn't have much capital, and participating with others and learning good practices before we ever operated well, which happened in 1989. And so during that growth, we really didn't anticipate ever operating wells. We didn't anticipate having big acreage plays. We didn't anticipate anything that came about, but just really through God's providence, we're able to put together good ideas with hard work, and over time began to accumulate larger investors where we could start operating our own wells. And that was kind of the start of the Chesapeake story.
And I wanted to ask you, what was your strategy in those early years? Because it seemed like you didn't have much investor capital yourself. You had a strong desire and a strong work ethic. So I'm curious, what was the strategy in those early years?
We were on to some pretty good projects, and as you mentioned, didn't have a whole lot of competition. We did have a decent investor base because we were, much like today, we were focused on free cash flow. We had good outcomes on the wells we participated in. We put together acreage plays and sold those, then used that money back into, we did a good job of reinvesting our extra cash. So Aubrey and I both put everything we made back into the company. And during that time, we were able to build up a decent ability to participate in other people's wells. And through selling acreage and just coming up with ideas and really outworking a lot of our competition. And that we were very fortunate that we were in the very early days of the vertical, what is now called the Scoop play, which was the golden trend of southern Oklahoma, and then another field called Sholem-Alechem. And that Sycamore Woodford production now, along with the Hunton Devonian play, was what really was the backbone of Chesapeake. So we worked really southern Oklahoma. And then by 1990, there was a lot of other activity going on, and it was just the beginning of the horizontal drilling phase in South Texas, really in around Frio County, Texas, and what is now, the Eagle Ford, which started out as the horizontal Austin Chalk play around a lot of vertical Austin Chalk production. And that's where we gravitated to after we started operating. We had a base of operations in southern Oklahoma, in Lindsay, Oklahoma, we had a service company that we operated. And then along with that, started drilling horizontal Austin Chalk wells. We started with high angle wells really in southern Oklahoma before ultimately that became a horizontal play. But it was much later in the sequence of horizontal drilling than in South Texas, where the Austin Chalk production was early on. That was being founded by a couple of companies. Oryx Energy out of Dallas was a big operator in the Frio County area. And then Union Pacific, which later moved into Anadarko, was the larger operator in the eastern part of the play around College Station, Texas. And we chased that trend across Texas, South Texas, all the way from Pearsall to College Station over the next 3 years. And ultimately in 1993 went public with Chesapeake.
And I wanted to dig into that a little bit more with you because Chesapeake is really the pioneer in the growth of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing that was at the root of the U.S. shale boom. And I'm curious, what led you to adopt these new production techniques? And how big a risk did you feel you were taking at the time by adopting some of these techniques, which were very innovative at the time?
And we were pretty good at deferring risk. We watched other people lead plays. Across the Austin Chalk play, we were looking for really not even a zone that needed to be fracked. It was open hole fractures that were overpressured. And we were able to glean off of other people when they were drilling wells that they were having success, and then leapfrog into different areas ahead and buy leases and start drilling our own locations. So the technology, though, was very, very young. So we were drilling overpressured reservoirs without putting any mud on the formation, using 10-pound brine, and drilling wells with rotating blowout preventers where you had a lot of pressure at the rig floor that would be unheard of today. That was in the early to mid 90s. We did start using more mud and understanding that it didn't run fractured reservoirs to drill with very heavy mud in the mid 90s. But really in all of the different plays that we started to work at Chesapeake, the Barnett was the first true shale play that we started working in. And I had a pretty good grasp between around where I thought through the work that our engineering and geological teams did of where we needed to focus. And we were pretty, I guess, consistent in the thickness of the shale we needed in the Barnett, and stayed away from more of the fringe areas. And then just with Aubrey's drive and ability to raise capital, we tended to be able to get the capital we needed to drill in those early days. And then the Fayetteville came next, and we started working it fairly hard. And then I left Chesapeake before the Haynesville. So we'd just, or Marcellus, we'd just purchased the Northeast U.S. production from a group that had been backed by Morgan Stanley. And that led into the Marcellus discoveries. But really the Haynesville and Marcellus were post me being at Chesapeake. I wasn't as big of a shale fan as I was in more of the carbonates and tended to move towards the reservoirs that had a little more storage capacity. I frankly was just totally wrong about the Marcellus, and I thought that the Haynesville was just a little too deep and expensive for a true shale that depleted as fast as it did. But all that to say is that there were a lot of other acquisitions and drilling in non-shale plays along with shale plays as we developed out the company.
And as you developed, development takes money, takes financing, takes investment. You mentioned Aubrey being able to raise that. I was curious, how important was it to have the U.S. natural gas futures market, the Henry Hub market, for managing your risk and helping to finance that investment and growth? How did you use the futures market in those days?
Yeah, we were aggressive hedgers. We tended to believe in our little bit of knowledge of the market and would put on hedges. We used different structures with different banks, but yes, we used and still do today. Any company that has any type of debt usually has some amount of hedging in place. And we probably were a little more aggressive at that at Chesapeake than others at that time, using the Henry Hub and using the NYMEX strip in general with long-term purchases. And we were good about keeping up a budget in place that we adhered to at that time, and with raising both debt and equity. And so Aubrey and Mark Rowland did a very good job from the financial side of the business and keeping really enough capital coming into our business that we were able to drill and buy in any place that we chose to. We were very fortunate to have a lot of early success in the Austin Chalk, and we used that to raise a lot of capital. And then ultimately, when we switched into a natural gas phase and made acquisitions, we were well financed to be able to do that also.
And you mentioned that some of the later shale plays didn't particularly strike you in the beginning, but I'm curious, obviously the shale boom overall transformed the energy landscape in the U.S. and the world. When did you know that the shale boom would become so big?
Really, I looked at it all as a continuation of just the pioneering of service companies and how that you could drill horizontal wells in general. Just the efficiency gains have been made not only in the 90s and the early 2000s, but today, of using all types of techniques, especially when starting with bits and just how quickly you can drill. Those were the main challenges that were overcome more than the reservoir. So it's always been known that oil and gas was in shale. It's how much would you have to spend to get it out. And early on, I was more of a skeptic that we could ever get to the efficiencies needed in order to be able to make the amount of return that you needed for the investment. That over time, as you saw, different techniques being used and longer laterals with larger fracs that you could extract enough gas and oil out of these different shales that they would be profitable. But most of the zones that are drilled in the Permian or in other reservoirs outside of the two main true shale plays are in more of a carbonate sequences rather than shale. But the word shale plays and shale zones is really synonymous with horizontal drilling and adding to production in the U.S. So I took it at really the saying that when did we learn about the shale plays is when did we learn that you could find a tremendous amount of oil and gas that was untapped by vertical wells by drilling horizontally. And that really started with the Barnett in the late 90s, early 2000s, whenever people started drilling horizontally with using fracture treatments inside of those zones.
Yeah, I keep going back to that image you mentioned earlier of you sitting at the table coloring in the map of the different oil fields. And listening to you, it sounds like you had an extremely precise knowledge of fields and reservoirs and what it would take to get oil out of them. Is that true?
Oh, I not technically. I have a decent memory, and I've worked a lot of different reservoirs over time with a lot of great people. I did gravitate towards the operations side of our business early on, and left the financial part of the business up to my partners, and that was always a very good relationship for me. Financially, I'm not nearly as astute as most, but I can understand some of the things that happen in the field.
Well, you've also told me that you've not been more bullish natural gas since the Chesapeake go long move in 1998. What's making you so bullish about natural gas today?
Much the same thing. So in 1998, Aubrey and Mark made a trip to California and met with the executives of Calpine. And at that time, we had just over 400 vertical rigs running in the U.S. The idea was there was going to be cheap gas forever, and we just lived through the two terrible decades of the 80s and 90s in our business. And everybody thought, including Calpine and other providers of electricity, that natural gas was going to be the cheap source of fuel forever that would supply our country. And it didn't take us very long to determine that there wasn't enough supply in place to be able to handle the amount of demand that others were bringing into the market, basically through power generation. And that was at a time whenever, most of the generating capacity was coming from coal. So as over time now, you fast forward to basically 25 years later, you see the exact same thing, in my opinion, is that we have amount of demand coming on that can't be met with the amount of supply that we're able to deliver today. Especially if you think of what the changes have been made in our industry since 2018. We formed Mach in 2017 to go buy some distressed assets and you have free cash flow and distribute that cash back to our investors. And that now has been taken over by our whole industry. That model of how can I not grow production, not have a unceasing amount of growth, but to really have a company that focuses on free cash flow, keeps our production modestly growing to flat, and is able to have a reinvestment rate that allows distributions to be going back to the shareholder. That hasn't happened since the 1990s. So we've had over 2 decades of time, or basically up to 2 decades when it started changing really in around 2020 post-COVID, that companies said and investors demanded that we change our ways. So if you couple that with you have this increasing amount of demand. I listen to the folks at Antero fairly closely because I think they're one of the smartest management teams in the U.S. And they have us with basically to 2030 having 30 BCF of new demand coming towards the U.S. And even by the end of 2025, 6 BCF of that is going to be just in LNG. That doesn't include all the power gen of increases that we're seeing. So I don't think that we're in a place currently, even though we've had an extra TCF and a half of gas put in our laps basically through 2 warm winters and one period of time nearly a year long where Freeport was offline. We're working through that excess very quickly. So I believe that by the fall, we get back to kind of a neutral state of where the market should be. And we're going to be staring right at another 6 or so BCF of gas just in the U.S. with a couple of BCF in Canada and a BCF or so in Mexico going out the door in demand, not counting a record-breaking power gen every month. And not all of that's going to be serviced by wind and solar. It's the majority goes to nat gas to be covering it. And we're continuing shutting down coal plants or making them at least export out to India and China instead of here. So I don't see the math can work, and therefore, what Mach tries to do, what I try to do, is just be long molecules in this environment at the strip. So if I can buy something at the strip today, even though it's in contango, I'm very willing to do so because I believe long term, looking out past 25, 26, 27 and beyond, that natural gas will be above a $5 asset instead of below a $3.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, a big part of that bullish arithmetic is the export demand for LNG that the U.S. now has. With domestic U.S. natural gas prices still a fraction of the price of natural gas in Europe and Asia, I was curious, how does the reality of an LNG export market that's so robust change the landscape for a U.S. natural gas producer?
It just gives us more opportunity to get gas to the world. So I don't know where the world goes post the next 5 or 6 years out if Qatar or others overwhelm the market with gas. But I do know having a world market is good for all of us. It's good for every consumer. It's good for every producer to be much more like an oil market that is able to distribute out natural gas around the world. The LNG really boom and the ability to trade that worldwide is, in my opinion, a game changer and makes it to where companies can depend on long-term futures of natural gas.
And I want to ask you, coming back to some of the role being played by the government and investors, The attitudes of the US government and some ESG-minded investors towards natural gas, fracking, and LNG exports have vacillated over the years. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how big an effect this has had on US natural gas producers. And what attitude would you like to see the government and investors take towards natural gas production in the US?
I'm, I guess, somewhat ambivalent as to what the government does, because ultimately it does affect the markets. And if we're restricted, prices will probably move up. And so I don't necessarily get too bothered about the political statements. However, what I believe should happen is that all governments should be embracing every type of new energy, because we're going to need all types to really go forward with this electrical revolution that we're having today in power. And I don't see that really slowing down any. So I think that we do need everyone to do their part, including wind, solar, and natural gas. And if we're moving towards an energy transition to be cleaner, natural gas is the product that can deliver that. So I just think there should be a general around the world embracing of natural gas as a key role in our future energy policy.
And as you mentioned, today you're the CEO of Mach Natural Resources. It's an independent upstream oil and gas company working in the Anadarko region, so western Oklahoma, southern Kansas, Texas Panhandle. I wanted to ask you, what opportunities for continued natural gas production growth in the U.S. do you see now? Can we keep the growth going?
Two different questions there. I think at Mach we can, just because there's still a lack of capital in our business, and we can buy production at prices that haven't really, I haven't seen in my career until 2018, where we can actually go buy production at and getting all of undeveloped lands for free with paying no blue sky, just buying PDP PV10 or less on production. So we believe we'll grow our company through that way, but it has to be accretive to our distribution. So that's really our focus. And we need to stay under a turn of leverage and have our reinvestment rate under 50%. I firmly believe we could grow production in the U.S. if that's a path that investors want. I don't necessarily believe that investors want us to be growing production. We did that for a couple of decades and destroyed more capital than we ever made. The idea of growth of EBITDA, of paying management teams to grow EBITDA, is really out of vogue and should be, and going back to a time that we keep our production in check, and not because we don't want to grow, but because we want to throw off free cash flow back to our investors. That is being embraced, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I do see growth happening, but it's going to be really a managed growth, not like it was, in my opinion, in the 2000 to 2018 time period.
And I wanted to ask you, you said that production, you can acquire that fairly inexpensively these days. Why is production priced so cheaply right now?
There's less capital providers. Private equity is just a small amount compared to where it was 10 years ago. I think funds are having more difficulty raising capital for energy in general, and I don't think it's necessarily a loved asset in the market, and that there has been a massive amount of very large firms that don't want to invest in energy anymore. And so that allows those of us who do have access to capital to be able to buy things at what I think is very inexpensive prices. We'll pay the strip for natural gas in contango and be happy with that. We'll buy the strip in backwardation and crude and be very happy with that also.
First off, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been fascinating. And before I let you go, I wanted to ask you, because as we kind of look to the future, I feel like much like the shale boom, the energy transition to a lower carbon, more electrified energy system is going to require both new sources of energy and new technologies for producing them. I'm curious, what lessons from your experience in the shale boom over the past several decades would you offer to other energy producers as they work to build the next future of energy?
Yeah, as I think of companies in general, I like where we're at as an industry today. I like being a healthy industry and one that is properly funded and one that looks to distributing back cash to shareholders. I think in the long term, that will keep bringing people back into the oil and gas business. And as far as the other transitional energy providers of solar and wind and other types of energy, I think their overall is seen as good, and it is good. And I think it needs to be embraced by everyone and will be. And so my belief is that if we want to, which I believe everyone should want to, continue to thrive and move forward instead of moving back into time without energy, we need to embrace all these different types of ways that we can provide energy in the future. And I believe that will get capital over time, and each of these areas can thrive.
Thanks again to Tom Ward, CEO of Mach Natural Resources. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of The Future of Energy. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets. Facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.